What's up, guys? Welcome back. It's Matt, and I've got a rare inside video planned for today. So a couple weeks ago, I had a great time exploring the woods and making some woodland wildflower scenic images. And I promised in that video that you and I would get together later and we'd talk through the editing process. So I only showed the raw files in the video. Today, you and I together will see the processed images for the first time as I go through the process of making them on the computer. But I had an idea. Recently, I was touring through one of our local art galleries, and there was an exhibit on display that did an excellent job of demonstrating some basic art principles. And I thought I would see if I could elevate my photos in the editing process by applying some of those basic principles of art. But there's a twist. All the art in this exhibit was made by middle school students. Okay, let's jump into it. The photo editor that I use is Adobe Lightroom. It's a really popular editor. It's very easy to get. And in fact, there's a link if you'd like to purchase it down in the video description. What I like about Lightroom is it's very good about cataloging my entire inventory of files. And I've got five years of photo files in my catalog. And it keeps it all really well organized for me. So I was actually going to record this whole video in the gallery, but they started doing some construction in the room next door. Another organization is moving in the adjacent room. So I had to cancel that plan. I made some quiet B-roll to introduce you to some of the artwork that I'm going to use for demonstration, and we'll do the editing right here in the studio. So I'm going to share my screen now. I'll put it over here. Let me get out of the way. So if you missed that video, the photos we made on location were these 5 raw files. 2 of a first scene and 3 of a second scene, and we'll use these as the material to produce our 2 images. For the first scene, I made this exposure, which, as you can see from here on this area, was a slight amount of clipping on the histogram, and I noticed that on scene when I was making the photograph, and so I made this second darker exposure just in case there was any information in those bright areas that I really wanted to retain. That's not only up here in the sky, but you can see in the reflections here down in the foreground mayapple. There are also some really bright spots, and so I took that safety exposure to make sure that I retained some detail in case I needed to use it in the photo later. And you also notice that in the first exposure there's some lens flare, and I saw that when I played back that first exposure as well. And in the safety exposure, I used my hand to block the stray light so that there's no lens flare in the second photo. So between those two, I should have everything that I need to make a photo, but we'll see. In the second scene, we came to more of a foreground focused photo. I shot this from really low, and putting the foreground really close to the camera like that presents this challenge of maintaining everything in focus. So I took these 3 exposures at different focal lengths, so you'll notice as I scrub through them that the image zooms in slightly as the focal plane moved back. So there's a little bit of focus breathing with this lens, and you can see that in this last exposure, the background is very sharp. In the second exposure, the middle ground is very sharp. And then in the last photo, you'll notice that the foreground is really nice and sharp, but the background is quite blurry. And that's the obstacle that you have to overcome when you have your lens really close to your focal subject. So I'll use a special software called Helicon Focus to make a stack of these. But in some instances, Photoshop can also be used, and Photoshop is included with your purchase of Lightroom. But today, I've paid for a subscription to Helicon Focus, and generally it does a better job. And so I'll use that as my demonstration today. So I think we'll start with this photo, and while I'm getting this exported and through Helicon Focus, why don't I also tell you about a basic art principle that was demonstrated in the gallery show that I'm going to use in this as well. This batch of artwork in the back of the gallery isn't from the middle schoolers. It's actually made by my middle school art teacher, Bill Meyer, and whenever I see Bill around, or as I'll forever call him, Mr. Meyer, I have to tell him how often I advise photographers on the unforgettable lessons he used to give our middle school art class on the concept of perspective. Mr. Meyer taught us perspective by having us make perspective line drawings like this one by seasoned artist and aspiring 7th grader Owen Lane, showing off the importance of nice straight perpendicular vertical lines and a ground plane that converges toward a level horizon. So Lightroom has a couple of great built-in tools, and honestly not often used enough to help correct the perspective that's created by this scene. So in the old days when you had a camera that was, one of those big box cameras with a film plane, and a camera lens that was mounted on a flexible bellows, the photographer could do this correction in the camera. So I only bring that up so you think we're not cheating. This is like a basic photographic operation that we're doing here, but we're going to do it in software because the digital camera, unless you have a specialized lens, the digital camera doesn't allow for that kind of tilting of the focal plane. So first I'm going to make sure that the lens corrections are applied, right? So you can see if I remove the profile corrections, that's actually going to bring the distortion back into the edges, which is causing some of the skewing out towards the corners. So some of that's corrected when I enable the profile corrections, and then I'll be able to correct that a little bit more using the transform section. So if I do a vertical transform, you can see that I can tilt the photo forwards and away from the camera. And when I tilt the photo forwards, notice these trees in the center, they become more upright. And then if I click constrain crop, it's going to take away that white border at the bottom where we sort of transform the image out of the viewing area. So I'll turn that transform off and on so that you can see. So it's a subtle difference, but I think a worthwhile correction to make. And then there's still some skewing to the edges, and that's just that's just the nature of shooting at wide angle. You can't make all the corrections, but I think you can see we've made a substantive correction by applying this transform. And then I'm also going to make a slight level correction. So I did verify that the photo was level on scene, but I think we can do a little more to help the eye. So I'll just use the crop and straighten tool has got this little ruler or level tool, and I can drag it across, right? And you can see that. So this enhancement just makes the photo feel more level. The camera was actually level, but there's a slight slope on the horizon line. And now that also brings this tree a little more upright. And I'll show you here with the ruler tool, you can also run it down the center of a vertical object and level the photo that way. So I have to give props to my middle school art teacher and my friends in middle school from the exhibit who inspired me to make this correction on my photo. Okay, one thing I might have thought to mention is that the art that I'm using for this demonstration is displayed at one of our local community art galleries, and it's where my first exhibit is going to be shown in June. If you didn't hear about it in the video where we made these photos, I announced that I've got that gallery exhibit coming up, and I'm really excited about it. If you guys want to contribute to the effort of helping me fund building the gallery, there's a link down in the video description where you can get a preview of the show and make a contribution by pre-purchasing a print or just giving a donation. So as I browsed through all those images in the gallery, something really stood out to me, and that was that some photos grabbed my attention better than others, and the ones that grabbed my attention seemed to make really good use of a consistent color palette. And amidst the chaos of all those different colors, the artwork that grabbed my attention the most were the ones that used simple, what's called analogous color schemes, right? Schemes that use colors that are close together on the color wheel, for example. So I'm looking at this photo and thinking, how can I make it maybe more analogous? One strong clash of color that you'll notice here is that the sky is really blue and the grass is green. And I didn't really envision that when I was making the photo. I put the sun directly in front of the camera lens and sort of anticipated that the sky would be washed out. So I think letting these darker parts of the sky where the blue is showing through, letting those go completely to white will help harmonize the colors in the photo. I'll show you how to do some corrections that will help me with that. So I'm going to use a graduated linear gradient, drag it down over here, and you can see already because it was preset to a positive exposure value, it's already lifting the corner. I hate how this new version of Lightroom puts this thing right here over the corner of the photo, but maybe if I zoom out a little bit. So yeah, you can see how this, how raising the exposure is bringing that corner from blue to white. But it's also creating kind of a nice, soft, ethereal effect, a glow to the top of the sky, and so that doesn't look bad. I'm gonna raise the exposure just until that top right corner goes completely to white, and I'm gonna leave it right there. Okay, this is looking good. Let's take a before and after look again. Before and after. Yes, this is looking much better to me. So another principle that I think I can apply to this photo is some shading. I noticed that a lot of the young artists in the gallery had caught on to the fact that they can use shading to create the illusion of depth in their 2D images. I'm going to see if I can apply some of that here. So how do I shade a photo that's already taken? Well, that's a great advantage to bringing your photo into an editor where you can really tweak things. The technique of brightening and darkening parts of an image is referred to as dodging and burning. It's a tradition that we've received from way back in the film days when photographers would transfer from the negative onto a print. They would often selectively brighten and darken certain parts of the images to add emphasis and drama and contrast. So, but from an art perspective, a good use of shading is to give objects more dimension. So for example, these tree trunks are round in shape, and if I darken one side and brighten another side, it'll give the illusion that there is some depth to that object. So I'm going to use the brush tool in Lightroom, right? Just going to grab a brush, and I'm going to make it negative exposure. I'm going to paint it onto this, so I see that the light source here is behind the tree on the right side, so I'm going to darken the left side of the tree just to give that slight illusion. And now you can see I can play with the adjustment after I've brushed it on, and I can also take an eraser and brush the adjustment back off the right side of the tree. And we'll give a before and after on that. Before, you see how adding the mask brings in a little of the illusion of depth to the tree. I'm going to go around the photograph and make some dodging and burning adjustments that I think help add depth to the image. And one final adjustment I'm going to make is to really amplify the importance of the light source to the image. So I'm going to reselect that original graduated mask that I put over the sky. I'm going to use the highlights slider to bring that down so that the sky is sort of a middle gray shade. And then I'll make a new radial gradient and put it right where the light source was and raise the exposure just in that area so that it hits the value of white. If I hit Option and raise the white slider, I can see which parts of the area are clipped to white, and that clipping is occurring right where I want it to, right here behind the tree, where the light source is, the sun. And lastly, in the darkening work that I'm doing in the shadow areas, I think I can be effective by sinking the blacks and the shadows down, but raising up the levels of the whites and the highlights to show off those wildflowers. And finally, because the background is so washed out, I'll see if maybe a slight hazing effect might make that look a little more natural. So I'll use the dehaze slider, and I'll slide it to the left. Yeah, and you see how now the highlights sort of start to bleed out into some of the darker parts of the objects in the foreground. And that makes that really bright light source look just a little more natural. Let's look at the before and after and see if we like the adjustments we made. Before, after, before, and after. So I think this is a much more effective photograph in conveying the information that I'm seeking to convey through it with the adjustments that I've made. Thanks again, middle school art students. Okay, let's look at the second photograph, which was actually the first one that we took. So right off the bat, you may recall from the video that I mentioned I didn't want to cut off this mayapple in the foreground. I actually composed it using the movie mode on the viewfinder at a 16:9 aspect ratio. So I'm going to restore that aspect ratio here. I'll just use the cropping tool to change the aspect ratio back to 16:9, and you'll see that will automatically bring in the original crop where I wasn't cutting off any of the mayapple. So that looks pretty good. Maybe I can even take it just a little bit higher. So if I go up to the Tools menu and to the Crop Guide Overlay, I can actually change that to a rule of thirds grid. And I can use that to help guide my composition a little bit to make sure that I've got about an equal amount of attention paid to the trees in the background, the midground here, which is these fallen branches, and the foreground. So I think I'll actually just use that guide to help me out a little bit and make sure I've got a fairly well-balanced image. And that feels just a little bit too top-heavy. This crop looks about appropriate to me. Okay, now I'm just going to apply those same art principles to this photo and see what we can make out of it, starting with perspective corrections. So this photo wasn't taken from as low, so there's not as much perspective correction required. But I will play with it and see if I can enhance it in any way. If I tilt it towards, so if I tilt the top up, I can see the trees start skewing away, so I don't want that. And if I tilt it back down, it may, I think that does help just a little bit. So I got a +6 adjustment there. Okay, so this is before the perspective correction and after. I also don't have as much challenge in terms of palette in this image, but what I think I will do is go down to the HSL tab, the Hue, Saturation, and Luminance tab. So what I'm going to do here is select Hue, and then I'll use this tool to selectively vary the hue of just this color. And I can take it more to the blues and greens, or I can take it more to the oranges and yellows. And I think maybe just a little bit towards the yellow, about 6, and then I can change the saturation of that as well. Just that one color. And then, now that I've got it to where a place where I feel like that color is balanced to the rest of the colors in the photo, I can play with the global vibrance and saturation adjustments to put it right where I want it. And so the camera also favored to put a fairly reddish tint on this photo, and it's not obvious when you're looking at the plants, but when you look at the trunks of the trees, you can see they've got this reddish color. And so I'm going to just dial the tint back just a little bit towards the greens to neutralize the reds, the unnatural reds that I'm seeing in the tree trunks and the branches. Now our color palette is looking pretty good to me. I'm going to raise the exposure of this just a little bit, just where I can just start to see a little detail in these trees. And again, I'm not trying to retain color in the sky, so letting it go to white is okay. Okay, perspective and color looking good. I'm going to do some dodging and burning now and see if I can maybe accentuate and add some depth to the photo. Now I'm going to paste these adjustments onto the second photo, and I'll try to match the exposures the best I can. I'll pull them into Photoshop because I really want to try to take out this unsightly lens flare right here in the middle. And if that's not successful, then I may just try to clone it out. I don't know if you guys want to sit through that whole process. I'll speed it up a little bit for you. Okay, so now I've got all those adjustments made in a final separate file. I'll reset the adjustments on the original file so we can have a look at before and after, and you guys tell me if you appreciate the improvement. For my taste, I think I'd rather hang the second one on the wall. So if you didn't notice from my shirt and my extreme thirst, I ran a half marathon yesterday, and it was a really gorgeous course. It ran out through the countryside, and the route actually gave me exposure to a couple scenes that I want to check out. So the light is getting quite tasty right now, and I say we bug out of this room and let's go do some in-the-field photography. I've got a location in mind. Actually, why don't we just save that for next time? I did just run a half marathon yesterday, and these suckers are pooped. It's springtime in the countryside, so subscribe, join along, and until I see you then, you keep an eye out and a foot forward, and thanks for watching.